Hello and welcome back everybody to the Foodbuild factory, where today we're going to take a look at the Enlightened. That's the guy you can see on screen right now. And as always, we're going to take a look at the perks, mutations, equipments, and everything else in the second half of the video. And in the first half of the video, I'm going to show you some gameplay and talk about the build in itself. So what we're going to do today is something very special that I had in mind for quite a while, but really most of the builds I came up with I just scrapped again. And this time around I felt like, yeah, I finally managed to find a use for the suppressors effect. So what I wanted to focus on here is, firstly, why exactly is the suppressors effect interesting? Now, the main thing is, it's one of those legendary effects you can get on weapons that just never really got any attention for, in my opinion, mainly opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is, on paper, the effect isn't bad. It's pretty solid. It's something you actually have seen in other MMOs. It's just basically reducing the target's damage output. So once you hit an enemy, its damage output is reduced for quite an amount of time. Has been buffed in the recent past, so I think we're talking about 25% less damage for something like 10 seconds or so. We're going to see that sooner or later when I will show the weapon itself. And yeah, overall, that's not something bad. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and the reason it never really took on and people never really used it is, as I said, opportunity cost. What I mean by that is that there's simply not a whole lot of reason to increase your tankiness in this game via an effect like this, because you're pretty much always better off just, yeah, straight up improving your damage output to begin with and kill things quicker. And that way you will overall end up getting less hurt anyways. But it's not really equal on every single weapon, talking about the opportunity cost. So my approach here was to go with a melee weapon. And the reason for that is that, as I said, the opportunity cost isn't as high with this build. Reason being is that ever since Bethesda changed the damage model to additive rather than multiplicative, um, melee is one of those builds that was hit pretty much the most, in my opinion, because what it basically did was that now every damage buff, talking about legendary effects like aristocrats, junkies, even bloodied, only do affect the base damage of the weapon. And this overall is pretty hurting on most weapons, because yeah, it's just, yeah, weapon effects are way less effective nowadays. But it's especially hard on melee weapons, since also strength, the bonus damage from strength that you get with melee weapons, has also been made additive. So basically that means that the base damage of a melee weapon is way less than you usually would see. So a lot of people just assume that, yeah, your base damage is when you unequip all the slugger, gladiator, whatsoever perks, unequip, sorry, unequip bloody mess and everything, you get the point. You will then see the base damage of the weapon, no modifications. But when it comes to melee weapons, you also have to take a look at the weapon under all of the circumstances and under the circumstance that you only have one strength. And once you take that into account, yeah, the damage of melee weapons is pretty abysmal. It's pretty pathetic, to be honest. And that means that, yeah, stuff like, as I said, aristocrats, junkies, and so on, just all of them aren't too effective anymore. Meaning that, yeah, if you have a really good setup for a melee build, you'll probably rather have an increase of like 5 to 10% in your damage from a 50% damage buff, rather than, as I said, the 50%. On most range weapons, I would say it's something like 30% in reality. So not using any damage buff on a melee weapon just isn't too much of a loss to your build or your damage output. It's still relatively comparable to what you had otherwise. And that means that, yeah, you can actually try to use something else like the suppressors effect. And as you see here, it really adds to the tankiness. Now, one other factor was that first, when I wanted to take a look at the suppressors effect, I really wanted to use a build that is able to hit a lot of targets to begin with. What struck to my mind was explosive, because explosive also is one of these builds that does a lot of damage to begin with, even without legendary effects, and so you could basically live without anything like two-shot or so. But I'm pretty sure that the explosive, the splash damage, doesn't really activate the suppressors effect when it hits an enemy, because how explosive weapons work is that they have a projectile and a splash damage part of the projectile. So yeah, you have to hit an enemy in order to get something like the suppressors effect or the tenderizers effect to work. I'm pretty sure at least of that. And therefore, yeah, it wasn't really the best decision, and ultimately you did lose out on a lot of damage. So yeah, naturally my next best guess was to go for a melee weapon. In addition to all of the damage effects and so on, another thing that makes melee weapons good contender here is that even anti-armor is not as good as an effect on melee weapons. I mean, I have shown it off in the past, and it's one of the better ones, don't get me wrong. But due to the fact that you have Incisor, which is already a massive increase in armor penetration, and from a perk, we're able to penetrate 75% of an enemy's armor just from that perk. That also means that anti-armor is also not as effective as it could be. So yeah, that's a long talk for basically all I wanted to say is I think melee is a good contender for the suppressors effect, and the last thing that makes it so is that additionally to that, you also have a build that usually takes a lot of damage, or should be able to soak up a lot of damage, just because you're loud and proud. Stealth with melee is not really the best thing in the world to do, and overall, yeah, taking damage is just a very considerate part of being a melee build. And overall, yeah, I actually found that it works out very well. So in addition to just reducing the damage output of an enemy that you are actually hitting, what I wanted to do here is trying to get a little bit of a passive effect going on, that so that I can also bring the suppressors effect to enemies that are not actively attacked by me. And my hopes are that Ricochet does this. So one thing we definitely know is that Ricochet carries the Vampire's legendary effect. So if you have a Vampire's weapon in your hands and Ricochet activates and hits the enemy that was actively shooting at you, you will gain a little bit of health back. And yeah, as I said, my hopes are that the same goes for the suppressors effect, meaning that if an enemy hits us with a ranged weapon and the projectile ricochets, that enemy will then be also hit by our suppressors effect. And lastly, I do have a full set of armor that has a chance to reflect, not reflect melee damage, but incendiary, no, to, yeah, light enemies on fire when they attack us in melee. So that's also something I hope carries over the suppressors effect. And overall, I can't really tell if all of this actually worked, but in the end, I think I came up with a very tanky build, which was just the goal here. The damage output definitely is lower than compared to like some other melee builds, but I really feel like we're not missing out on too much here, since yeah, we can definitely face tank most enemies. We don't really have to worry about any situation. Even in daily ops, I was doing rather well for the most part. We are using a rather strong melee weapon to begin with, a super sledge. Only reason I'm saying that is because you possibly don't know just from looking at the weapon, because we're using a skin here, which makes it look like a torch. Basically, when it comes to the looks of the build, we are basically trying to go for the look that currently is on the title card. When you're launching your game, you will see this cultist uh, with basically this uh, outfit and a super sledge with that skin. So I thought that was rather fitting for the timing of the video. And overall, I really like the build. I had a lot of fun. It's definitely one of the more fun melee builds that I had in a while, because you just don't have to worry as much. As I said, melee enemies like Deathclaws or um, Behemoth, for example, they become completely irrelevant. Now, they can be a little bit unnerving just because they are staggering you, but in terms of damage output, you can reduce their damage output to nearly zero. Combining the suppressors perk, suppressors legendary effect, and the blocker effect, yeah, barely any damage comes through. Now, one thing should be said is we are trying all of this here on a pretty tanky build to begin with, meaning that we try to have relatively good armor rating. Well, armor rating is probably the least impressive thing here. Then we do have a mix of certain Slayer's effects, which also reduce damage from quite a lot of enemies. And lastly, we do have some other perks that also increase our resistances or stuff like dodgy, outright reducing damage output to begin with, as long as we do have access to action points. So yeah, overall pretty tanky build to begin with, but we're just doubling down on it with the suppressors effect. And for me, basically, I knew the build worked just because, yeah, ever since I was playing with it, I took like 3 Stimpaks or so, and that was in situations when I was swamped by um, armor penetrating Gutsies, for example. These guys will just always be a pain, but we can even face tank Assaultrons once we're hitting them pretty easily. So overall, yeah, very tanky build, very much fun with it. And yeah, as I said, I don't even think that the damage output is too bad, just because we have a swing speed weapon, which is the most important perk or legendary effect you can get on a melee weapon, in my opinion. Other than maybe power attack damage, that can also be very impressive. But yeah, the benefits from swing speed or power effect, power attack damage, heavily outweigh all of the effects you could otherwise get, like anti-armor or junkies, aristocrats, and so on. Now, there could be an argument to say that, well, Bloodied still works very well for melee builds, and that's definitely true. Um, Pretty much Bloody builds are the only melee builds that still can deal considerable amount of damage, in my opinion. Um, that's not due to the Bloodied effect exactly, though. I mean, sure, pays into account, but um, the main portion is just because you're using unyielding armor and increase your strength so heavily that you can actually get a lot of extra damage just by that. Meaning you could basically use a bloodied build and use the same weapon I do and still get a ton of extra damage and use the suppressors effect. However, yeah, as you know, I sometimes mention bloodied builds. I always say that, yeah, there's just no other option. If you want to have the most effective gameplay for pretty much 99% of the time, Bloodied is the way to go. But yeah, as you know, I don't really showcase Bloodied builds for the simple reason that they are plentiful. Pretty much every single Fallout YouTuber, Fallout 76 YouTuber that is, has a Bloodied build for pretty much every single weapon class. So yeah, I didn't feel the need to showcase something like that. And yeah, I'm going for full health builds, and I really think that this is one of the more fun melee builds I had. It just basically does what I expect a melee build to do, compared to older Fallout games, which is being very tanky and wailing down on enemies. Obviously, once it comes to tankier enemies, you will sooner or later just get a little bit bored. Say, Scorch Screen or something. You just waste your time. But other than that, yeah, you can take down everything. Um, Even Scorch Beasts and the like, and as I said, Behemoths go down relatively quickly if you time your power attacks right. Try to get a hit on the head every now and then, and yeah, that's basically it. The only enemy I found quite bothersome to fight was a Sheep Squatch, because it just became a tanking duel, to be honest. So on this occasion, we actually had to take a Stimpak, by the way, because yeah, that's the situation when the build falls a little bit flat is when you're really surrounded by high DPS enemies. Once you're thinning out the hurts a little bit, it becomes way more manageable again. So hitting this guy here, basically making him irrelevant, and yeah, now we basically survived the whole encounter in my opinion. And yeah, back to the topic. The only enemy I found a little bit bothersome to fight was a sheep squatch, for the simple reason that it has such a large health pool that really it just became a time thing rather than a challenge thing. Um, since he is predominantly melee, I mean he has this little spike throwing attack, but that doesn't do a whole lot of damage, it just staggers you. Um, I was not taking any reasonable damage from the sheep squatch, but other way around, I was just wailing at him for like 5 minutes or so. So that was a little bit of a bummer. But other than that, yeah, every single encounter I had was rather fun. I had a lot of fun with the build, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the gameplay part of the video. And now let's take a look at the perk itself. So first of all, our mutations, and as you can imagine, on a melee build, we do have quite a lot of them. We do have Bird Bones, Carnivore, Chameleon, Healing Factor, Marsupial, Scaly Skin, Speed Demon, Talents, and Twisted Muscles. So first and foremost, Bird Bones, bit of a leftover, you don't really need it. It has a debuff to your strength, so ultimately it's not the best decision in the world. However, a little bit more agility never hurts in my opinion, and it's a leftover from another build. I wouldn't have included it if I would have just mutated from the get-go here, but also I didn't feel like it was so out of place that I had to remove it or take my chance to remove it, and that's why it's here. Carnivore, this is a bit more important. For melee builds, Carnivore is always a very good option because there are some very easy and easily obtainable meat buffs that you can get that last for half an hour to an hour and give you pretty considerable damage buffs. Glowing Meat Steak, Mutant Hound Chops, those are very common. You can easily get a hold of them and basically always fight under the influence of them, and both of them will give you 20% extra melee damage with this mutation, so that's why Carnivore is pretty much always there when I'm making a melee build. I just don't show off the buffs during the video. Then we have Chameleon, which is yet another leftover from another build, so this has nothing to do here, but the thing is, it has virtually no downside to us, so that's why it's left there. You can just ignore it as it is. You haven't seen any change in gameplay due to the Chameleon mutation. Another big one is healing factor. Now, due to the fact that we are so tanky and use stimpaks very rarely, I found that healing factor was a good decision. I mean, we do have class freak anyway, so the debuff that stimpaks and every other chem is 13% less effective isn't as crazy, but it doesn't really matter anyways, as we're not using any chems usually. As I said, sometimes we're using a stimpak, but um, it's so rarely that you can live without any weight reduction perks for stimpaks, and you also can live with the downside that they're not as effective. And on the pro side, while we are taking very little damage in most fights, we do take a little bit, and after the fight we're just back to full health in no time. Then we do have Marsupial, which is pretty straightforward. More jump height and a little bit more carry weight is always beneficial. -1 intelligence. We are pretty dumb to begin with, so yeah, we could definitely live with -1 intelligence for extra jump height. Then we do have Scaly Skin, reducing our AP by 12, which is very little with Class Freak rank 3. And in addition to that, we do get damage and energy resistance, 50 each, which is kind of nice for the very little downside. Also, we're not really utilizing AP too much. Sure, it's nice to have for the occasional power attack, but mostly we are using it for dodgy. And when it comes to that, 12 AP isn't the world, so that's why it's here. At this point, another one that you could consider is Grounded to give you 200 more energy resistance. However, I found it relatively unnecessary, and I'm pretty sure it does decrease the damage output of our uh, heating coil modification for our Super Sledge. Wouldn't be the end of the world here, but still. It just wasn't too necessary, so I didn't bother getting it. Then we do have Speed Demon, which I have seen in the past people not use for melee builds because, yeah, they don't use the reload speed, so why bother? Now, the thing is, Hunger and Thirst growing slower is just virtually not a downside if you don't bother with it, as I not do on this occasion, and just the faster movement speed is nice to have in my opinion. Closing the gaps between you and an enemy faster is just beneficial. Then we do have Talent, which is a leftover from another build. We're not using it since we're not using unarmed weapons, but the only downside to us is -1 agility. So yeah, we could live with it. It ultimately didn't change the gameplay too much. Obviously, though, if you were to create this build from the get-go, Talent is just unnecessary. And lastly, we do have Twisted Muscles. This is basically the most important mutation for this build here. 25% extra melee damage and a chance to cripple is very beneficial. 12% less gun accuracy, completely redundant since we're not using guns, so no-brainer. Then we take a look at our equipment, and here it is, a suppressors, swing speed, reduced weight super sledge. As for the third perk, obviously reduced weight isn't really necessary here. Something like extra strength would be nice, probably, but it's really up to you. Suppressors obviously is kind of important for this build because it's what we're doing. So yeah, reducing your target's damage output by 25% for 5 seconds. Neat. Said a lot about it during the video, so not a lot to add here. And lastly, swing speed. You could consider power attack damage, could be interesting. However, due to the fact that we are using dodgy, I found that focusing on power attacks wasn't too much of a thing for me, unless I was fighting single targets, like as I said, behemoths, scorch beast, or sheep squatches and so on, where they don't really reduce our AP pool too heavily. But yeah, swing speed was the better option here and also makes it easier to keep that 25% damage debuff on enemies just because, yeah, you do have 5 seconds to hit in between in order to keep the effect active, which you can easily get without swing speed as well. You're not taking 5 seconds between hits, but just in case you're getting staggered or anything, you can just follow up quicker with swing speed, which should be obvious, and also it just increases your DPS so heavily that I think, yeah, this is the most important one here, despite, yeah, suppressors. And in terms of damage, we do some relatively impressive 217 damage and 16 fire damage. The fire damage, in all reality, isn't too crazy. It just was rather fitting because we are using a torch, basically, so not having any fire damage would have been a bit stupid. And yeah, that fire damage comes from the heating coal. And just in case, yeah, it's the burning torch paint. It's currently even available in the item shop, I think. I got this like a year ago or something, but yeah, it's back at the moment as far as I'm aware. Then we go over to our armor, and it's not too interesting. We do have an Exterminator's marine armor with the 5% chance to deal fire damage to melee attackers. It's buttressed, but otherwise doesn't have any modifications. What would have been nice is optimized bracers, I think it's called, or something like that. Oh, aerodynamic. No, it's aerodynamic. The one that reduces your power attack AP cost. But yeah, on this occasion just buttressed for best resistances and the effects Exterminators, AP Refresh, and as I said, 5% chance to deal fire damage to melee attackers. I already talked about the fire damage. It's kind of nice to ignite, that was the word I was looking for earlier. Melee attackers on occasion. I hope it also carries the suppressors effect. I wouldn't be too sure about that though. It's just, yeah, just a nice little touch. AP Refresh obviously is nice, and Exterminators, well, one of the less desirable Slayer effects, but still, fighting Milder Queen or so, it can be useful. Then we do have a Hunter's piece with poison resistance, and not a Hunter's piece with poison resistance, so the more interesting thing here is we do have 2 pieces of poison resistance, which doesn't sound like a lot, but makes a huge difference when you're fighting enemies with poison damage. Then we do have a Mutant Slayers piece. This is probably one of the more interesting ones because Mutant Slayers just is good. Gives us 1 extra intelligence, but that's hardly too interesting. And lastly, we do have a troubleshooter's piece with radiation resistance. As you can see, the legs are welded, so I didn't really have the butt rest modification. But when it comes to the torso, it's also buttressed and padded. I didn't really have dance on this character, but padded and fireproof, as you will see in a second, is enough. In terms of apparel, it's pretty straightforward here. We do have the cultist Enlightened robe and the Enlightened helmet, and when it comes to under armor, shielded secret service under armor for extra strength and endurance mainly, very beneficial. Going over to the perks, we do have 15 strength. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, and just because we are already not focusing on damage too much, we just had 3 ranks of slugger, so rank 1 of each. Then we do have martial artist, which gives us extra swing speed, which is very nice. Incisor, extra armor penetration, one of the better perks here. And last 6 perk points went into blocker, which I already talked about, reducing melee damage, incoming melee damage. Very beneficial and stacks up very nicely with the suppressors effect and our suppressors perk. And lastly, we do have barbarian. So one thing you could definitely do is ditch out barbarian, and rather than that, go over to rank 2 of each of the slugger perks. However, I found that barbarian still was kind of useful because we do have a lot of strength, so we can get the maximum out of it, and it just helps us because our armor isn't too crazy. Without barbarian, we are somewhere at around 250 damage and 100 energy resistance, something among those lines. So yeah, it's definitely good to help us get at least close to the point of diminishing returns. Hope you get my point. Then we do have Grenadier. This is simply here because we do have a legendary perk that makes it so if we kill an enemy, we have a chance to make it explode. And the explosion radius of this explosion is very small, so yeah, you have a very small chance to actually effectively get an effect out of it, unless you are using Grenadier, which increases the radius and makes it way more viable. And overall, it's just one special point that we have to invest because we can't go lower than 1. So ultimately, that was the most beneficial thing to put here in Perception, in my opinion. Then we do have Endurance, which is relatively high at 13. We do have Life Giver, just to increase our total amount of health points. We have Ghoulish, which really makes it so if we're fighting ghouls, we're basically immortal. Being tanky to begin with, they don't do a lot of damage, and giving us a little bit of radiation damage heals us in the process. Now we do have relatively high radiation resistance for a build that uses conventional armor, but still the amount of radiation that comes through from attacks by ghouls is enough to basically out-heal their incoming damage for the most part. Also, it's obviously nice when you are in irradiated areas, so fighting near a fissure site, for example, makes you basically immortal. Then we do have Adamantium Skeleton, another very beneficial perk, just for the simple reason that, yeah, all we wanted to do is being tanky and not use Stimpaks all of the time, and all of that wouldn't help us if we may have a lot of health points left, but our limbs are crippled and we then have to use a Stimpak just to walk again, other than waiting for like 2 minutes or so until they heal from their self. And lastly, we do have Fireproof. Yeah, when you want to be tanky, fireproof. If you don't want to be tanky, fireproof is probably the only thing you want to use. It's just always good and always there. So yeah, pretty straightforward. Then we do have charisma, and there's something you never seen before in one of my builds. The suppressors perk maxed out, 30% less damage for 2 seconds after you attack an enemy. So this is where swing speed on the weapon comes into consideration, because without swing speed, you can still get a follow-up hit in on your enemy within 2 seconds, but yeah, 1 stagger and you don't have a chance anymore. Anyways, this obviously synergizes very well with our suppressor's legendary effect, and you can imagine both of them combined reduce the target's damage output by 55%. I'm pretty sure that um, these debuffs from suppressing your enemies are multiplicative. Sorry, not multiplicative, but additive, but on this occasion it's a good thing. So yeah, we do have 55% less damage for 2 seconds once we hit an enemy, and then we do have 3 more seconds where it's just 25% less damage. Then we do have intelligence at 5. As I said, we're not the most intelligent person on the world here, just very basic 5 intelligence for makeshift warrior, just so we can use our super sledge a little longer. You could definitely live without Makeshift Warrior here. I just found it useful because, yeah, while you're not going to repair your weapon every 20 minutes without it, it still happens often enough so that you, yeah, I was bored by it, so therefore Makeshift Warrior 5 is here. Then we do have Agility, which is maxed out. We do have Action Boy maxed out just to get some more AP refresh. Then we do have one rank of Bone Survivor. You've seen that active once when we were fighting the Super Mutants now at the end. Just a little fail safe. Then we do have White Knight. Obviously, we are soaking up damage. That's our main deal here, and that means there's a lot of wear and tear on our armor. So White Knight was a very beneficial choice here, just to make it easier to keep your armor in tip-top condition, meaning that you don't run around with broken pieces, and if you have to repair them, it's cheaper. Then we do have Adrenaline. Recently, I've been told that there's rumors that Adrenaline doesn't work. Currently, it shows the buff in on your weapon when you're inspecting it in the Pip-Boy, but actually doesn't really increase your damage during the gameplay. I didn't really look too deeply into it for one simple reason. It has broken in the past, definitely, and yeah, if it is, it's just a matter of time before Bethesda is going to um, fix it. I mean, it can take up quite some time, but still, sooner or later, Adrenaline will work again, like it should be, and in that situation, it is a good choice. However, I didn't really find that there was a difference, anyways. Like, I think it works just from my observations, but yeah, anyways, Adrenaline is there. And lastly, we do have Dodgy. Now, there would be an argument to go for Evasive, but I didn't really have to level ups and found Dodgy to be a bit more beneficial here. Thing is, if you were to go for evasive, the good thing is you would definitely slip into the point of diminishing returns when it comes into your to your armor rating. So overall, you would still see pretty good difference in tankiness from evasive, and don't have the downside of losing out AP, which means you could use more power attacks. But ultimately, I found that Dodgy was the more beneficial choice here. Then we go over to luck, where we do have ricochet. This is one of the perks I talked a lot about during the video, so not a lot to say here. Even if it doesn't carry our suppressors effect, it still is a good choice here because it basically reduces your incoming range damage by 18% on paper. So yeah, either way, it's a beneficial perk for our means, and I think it does carry over the suppressors effect. Then we do have Class Freak, as you saw, we have a few unnecessary mutations, and even if not, yeah, Class Freak, not a bad decision anyways. You could go for something like Bloody Mess or whatever, or even Serendipity could be a choice, but yeah, on this occasion I went with Class Freak and let it be. And then we do have Storage Genes, just to keep sure we don't get any mutations we don't want, and we can keep the mutations we do want. And that leaves us with just our legendary perks. We do have legendary strength maxed, not maxed out, only at rank 2, giving us 17 base strength. Then we do have legendary luck and endurance. Those two give us access to more perk points. We do have what rats, just because, yeah, in addition to having armor that already has a relatively good radiation resistance, we get 75 more radiation resistance, making it so that, yeah, combined with healing 2 reds per second, we basically never have to use a red away. Then we do have collateral damage at rank 3, giving us a 16% chance to make enemies explode. I already talked about that. It's not the best perk in the world, but it's fun occasionally. And lastly, we do have taking one for the team. For once, I'm pretty sure I was on a team during the video. I hope it's low at least. So yeah, enemies that attack us take 30% more damage when they attack us. For like, I think it's not said here, but there's a bit of a timing going on, like it's 10 seconds or so. Not quite sure at the moment, but yeah. Anyways, it's just more damage. It's multiplicative, so it's very beneficial. And yeah, that was it. I hope you enjoyed the build, guys. It was something different for sure, just because we were focusing on a effect I have never shown off before, and I will bet my ass that you have never seen anyone making a build around the suppressors effect. Um, would be interested. Do you think you would consider trying something like this, or do you think the explanation came through as to why I think it's good for melee weapons? And yeah, anyways, have a good time and see you next time. Bye.